Logo fades into view. New York Association on Independent Living. Thank you to our 2022 webinar series sponsor, Waymo.
All right, looks like we are good to go. Thank you everyone for joining our 2022 webinar series, and a special thank you to our webinar series sponsor, Waymo. Today's webinar is focused on Kendras Law, a New York State law concerning involuntary outpatient commitment. This is an issue that comes up every few years as the state contemplates expansion or extension, I should say, and in some cases like this year, harmful expansions. Opposing these proposed expansions is one of NOW's top priorities this year, and we follow the lead of our friends and experts at NYAPRS in that advocacy effort. So I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Harvey Rosenthal, who is the Chief Executive Officer of NYAPRS and our go-to expert on Kendras Law. Take it away, Harvey.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good morning, everybody. I want to give a shout out first to Larry Roberts and Sue Ruff, who signed up. I'll mention this later, but who are signing up in support of a petition we're giving to the legislature a bit later today against the proposals that we're facing right now. So, well, welcome. I wish I could say I was happy to talk to you about this, but this is really the advocacy issue of my life, really, is this fighting back against forced outpatient treatment. And this is a rough year. So I'm gonna give you a backdrop. If I seem a little harried or what have you, it's true, because this is a really difficult day. Even this morning, you know, we're learning that both houses are not willing to go forward on most of the recommendations the governor put out last Friday, except on Kendras Law. So really, you know, I'm working it. And right, even this morning, we're trying to get an op-ed into some of the papers. Senator Brooke, the Senate Mental Health Committee chair, and I've written an op-ed, and we're hoping to get it out. Anyway, so I'm Harvey Rosenthal. I'm a person in long-term mental health recovery. And I've been the CEO here at NYAPRS for about 30 years. NYAPRS is a statewide partnership. Actually, I have a little thing here. It's like my slide is not moving down though. There we go. We're a state and national change agent. We're dedicated to improving services, public policies, and social conditions. Our focus all these years have been very simply recovery, rehabilitation, rights, community inclusion, and more recently, criminal justice reform and cultural competence. We do it through a variety of ways. The one we're talking about today is certainly policy advocacy. We do a lot of training of providers and states and other groups on these values and how to, you know, implement them. And also we created the Peer Bridger model in 1994. And it's now replicated around the country and in some parts of the world. And it's a transitional peer support model, helping people leave institutions and not come back to them. So I'm in the right crowd here with my friends here in the deinstitutionalization movement. We're all in with you about that, and we have right from the beginning. I want to say that, speaking of that, you know, early on in my work here, I used to hear the word disability, and I noticed it never meant us. It never meant people with psychiatric disabilities. So I reached out to you all, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, and you know, we've sort of been family for quite a while now, but it's just, it's been sort of a journey, I think, to really be able to all be in the same family, not like we are now, working closely together. And we're very proud that here in New York, we sort of were the face of that, and we are the face with you now. So I mentioned rights before. This is really a rights discussion. It's all about human rights. And I wanted to give you a little backdrop around where we come from here at NYAPRS, and some of you that are out there. Certainly Larry, I've known a long time, and everything I say he will reflect any given day. So we come from the rights movements. It's very, you know, it's central to who we are. Yes, we're about peer support, and we're about housing, and we're about any number of, you know, advocacy issues, psychiatric rehabilitation, peer innovations. But at the end of the day, it's always about rights. It's always about raising the bar for people, you know, for how they see themselves, how we see ourselves, and the system, and the budgets. It's raising the bar in the rest of with the public. that, whatever phrase you want to use, that, the recovery is the expectation and full community life as well. So we come back from the rights movement, and I think, one of the movements that really influenced us back in the 80s, perhaps before, is the civil rights movement. So I know that that was really a very telling example for people in the psychiatric survivor movement. And I'll talk about that just a little briefly. Certainly, we were influenced by the LGBTQIA+ movement. And you see to the left, we were inspired by you all, independent living. This is Ed Rollins. And we were very mindful of that, and so glad that we've been able to, over the years, find our way together. And of course the women's movement too. So all these movements sort of really come together. And in NYAPRS, we bring together other movements, peer support, psychiatric rehabilitation, and recovery movements in general. So we've tried to amalgamate all that under our tent here. So the psychiatric survivor movement really grew out of the things you see here, the abuses from psychiatry, the discriminatory policies, language, and posture of society towards people who did not seem normal, or who behaved in a different way and were being judged or self-identified as having a mental illness. So, these were really, you're probably familiar with this, but the overuse of coercion, forced drugging, shock therapy, really was what really drove a lot of the psychiatric survivor movement, which is in many ways focused in the beginning just on psychiatry and getting psychiatry and the medical model and medication, forced medication, out of their world and our worlds. And they're heroes. And so we have here, I'll just mention a couple here, is Harvey the Harp, one of our great heroes, going back to, he's originally from New York City, then in California, then back to New York City. But Harvey was a real big leader in our field, particularly around peer support, community organizing. These are other folks. These are from California, actually, our friends out on the West Coast. If you've been to NYAPRS conferences, the woman there on the far left, Sally Zinman, you've seen us feature her as a speaker or give her a Lifetime Achievement Award. You probably know, but if you don't, let me tell you about Judy Chamberlain. She's probably the godmother of the survivor movement. Judy is, as I understand it, and I sat with her on a board, the National Rights Protection Advocacy Board. But the larger story, as I heard it, was that she had a miscarriage and wound up in a psych hospital in Massachusetts, and was judged to, they didn't get what had happened to her and judged it as a mental illness and began treating her like a mentally ill person. And that set her into being a real revolutionary and a liberationist. So you see here her work. The book on the bottom left, On Our Own, Patient Control System, was really a seminal moment, a seminal volume at the time. You see Judy leading marches and all that. She set the template, I think, for what we should be doing and could be doing and how we could be doing it to fight for the rights of people, however identified. So I should just tell you that I identify as a person with a mental illness. And I didn't do that before until I fought this battle. And I do it because over the years, particularly at the national level, but we have people on the other side of us who feel very differently than we do. And I think they're kind of some of them are a very nefarious bunch. And one of the things they would say is, NYAPRS, probably all of you on the screen, you're not really talking about people with serious mental illness. Samson's not talking about people with serious mental illness. You're talking about, you cherry pick and you deal with people that are quote unquote high functioning, and you abandon people with serious mental illness. So this other side has to sort of pick them up. And so I really always wanted to make it clear, yes, we are. We're talking, whatever term you want to use, serious mental illness, mental illness. We're talking about people that you think can't work, can't recover, whose rights are not as important. And so it's been really critical to point out, yeah, we're talking about the same group. Don't back off and diminish who we're talking about. and how important that is. So I'm a little zooey today, so I'm going to make a left turn and just say a quick story about me. So very quickly, I grew up born in 1950 on Long Island, wound up going to college in New York City, wound up in a mental hospital on Long Island, back again for 6 weeks. Like so many people, they told me, wouldn't recover. Just I had fallen off the pathway of life, and I didn't know what would happen to me and how things were going to go. And it was quite difficult. I had some major issues with mood and anxiety, and I really crawled my way back up from that experience. And actually wound up coming up to Albany because I had friends up here, and wound up eventually. I wanted to work in the mental health system. I wanted to help people get free of what I had experienced. So in the mid 70s, I wound up working in the state hospital here in Albany, and saw everything, I'm telling you about. People were told they could never recover. They were talked about as if they weren't even there. They weren't consulted about their treatment. Everything was about sort of medication, independence, decision-making, self-determination, not expected. The illness above all was explained to me as I worked in the field. I worked in the psych hospitals I mentioned, and I was always out with the people that I supported. But when I tried to be out with the staff, that didn't go well. So I've always been out, but in those days, you had to be careful about, sort of being dismissed and discounted. But I saw all of those things happening, and I was told by the staff, there are things like, don't feel bad that people got readmitted. It's the illness. That's what they do. This is the best they can do, which to me meant this is all we have to do. This is the best we can do. I was told if people didn't show up for their appointments, just write down non-compliant, review in 3 months. Of course, I wouldn't do that. Got written up for being out of the office too much, to go where the people are, which is what we do in peer support and what we ought to be doing for people. I was told, don't use the word recovery. It gives people false hope, false expectations. Can you imagine? So eventually I wound up, working in a club, directing a club, and being part of this thing that became NYAPRS. But it's very personal to me. And, most of our board, so many of our members are people in recovery, and we're all very focused and all united about being for rights and against the creation of, the expansion of, and the permanence of Kendras Law. I just want you to know that background. So this was at a protest in California back in the day, and I think it really says it all. It's my body, it's my brain, it's my mind, it's my life. And so often, certainly the story I just told you, that none of that was considered back in the 70s, 80s. Some people say now. It's depends very much on where you go and who's in charge and how that's happening. But it's a big value to turn that around. So here we are so I'm in this job, 94, 92, I come over to NYAPRS, 93. And here it is, 1999 or so. And Kendra Webdale is pushed by Andrew Goldstein in the subway and dies. And now there's this hue and cry to do something, to create a law that would force people basically to take their medication and be in some form of treatment. Truth be told, and I'll say this to you, Larry, there was a group formed, Coalition to Stop Outpatient Commitment or something in New York. And it sort of kind of got off to a rocky start, and I wasn't intending to be as involved as I became, but it was so outrageous what was being said and the threats that were all around us around scapegoating that we have today, scapegoating, labeling as violent, overriding so-called, choice. So, I got very involved in that campaign. And when Kendra Webdale got pushed in the subway, turns out we had an Attorney General, Eliot Spitzer, became governor for a short time. And he had in his office a guy named Brian Stetton, who later turned out to be, and still is, our major opponent. But Brian was in that office and wrote the original Kendras Law, which was so bad that you could go into people's homes and inject them. That's how bad it was. But we and others made that go away. We did a news conference and just bashed the hell out of it. And they came back under George Pataki, the governor, with another version. And they put forward this bill, and I'll tell you about the tenets of it in a bit. We were really fighting this pressure, and there was a lot of people on the other side. Some family members, not all. Certainly these groups that have been formed to create this narrative that whenever there's any episode of violence, all of it could have been prevented if people were forced into treatment. That is just the mantra of this other side. Anytime, particularly a lot of what Kendras Law is about is New York City. That's where all the orders are. That's where the headlines are. That's where the tabloids are. So that's really drives this conversation in many ways. So the failure of New York City's mental health system has a lot to do with this as well. And I'll just say that a lot of the quick answer to so much of the issues when you find people who are languishing, are struggling, sometimes are violent, very rare instances, is system failure. It's not personal failure. It's not, some form of innate resistance and denial. So I rambled, if you know me, so I'll ramble a little bit more. There's something the other team calls anosognosia, and that became the narrative. Well, they don't know. There's something wrong with their brain. It's not just a lack of insight or unwillingness. They can't help themselves. They have this brain damage. Now, anosognosia really is a misused term by this side. It really has to do with strokes and Alzheimer's. But it doesn't stop them from creating this term and applying it to these poor people. They can't even help themselves. It's their brains that are broken in that fashion. So anyway, here we are, back to my story. We're fighting this campaign. The other side, anosognosia, lock them up, the frail, the suffering, mentally ill, this sort of thing. And it turns out, we're doing only modestly well. We had a small group. We were new to the whole thing. An article appears in the Times. It's called Bedlam on the Street, and it is actually the case file of Andrew Goldstein having been leaked to the New York Times, and they run the article saying, there's 17 times this man tried to get help. This is not a person that was trying to resist help. System failure. And a lot of it has to do with bad inpatient discharges, really to nowhere. 2 or 3 day admissions, 10 days, and then out with no discharge plan, revolving door, people struggling, no housing, no food, no connection. And so where there are certainly relapses, if you want to, or tragedy sometimes, a lot of it had to do with people were trying to get help and were failed by it. So that's so often the case of what happens in these episodes. So we're feeling good. Bedlam on the Street is educating the public. This man wasn't resisting. This is what really hurts, and it's happening this year, and it breaks my heart. When you're fighting a campaign like that, the last thing you need is public subway pushings. I mean, I'm not, I can't tell you enough about that. So there was one that year, right after the Times. Julio Perez pushed Edgar Rivera under the subway. Now the man has no legs. Now he's in a wheelchair. Now he's at news conferences with Mrs. Webdale fighting for Kendras Law. So, I mean, this view of violence drives Kendras Law. And there's also an underbelly of racism. And I'll talk about that a little bit, of poverty. There's so many factors here about who gets targeted and viewed as someone who ought to be coerced. The term it's used, you hear it, AOT. We don't want to use that. It's really a foolish, ridiculous term. People are not being assisted, they're being coerced. But that's the language. So if you hear AOT in New York, that's now the language everywhere around the country. That's what they mean. We used to call it involuntary outpatient commitment, certainly coercive coercion. So Kendras Law gets passed, and here are let me get this strip out of the way here. Here are the criteria under which the original law, and it hasn't changed that much. So people could be put on this order if they were 13 years old, suffering from a mental illness, It's a diagnosis. Here's a big one: is unlikely to survive safely in the community without supervision. Boy, is that used a lot. In other words, sometimes that's a headline that says they need Kendras Law or they could not to be in the community, almost to be allowed in the community. So it ranges from they couldn't make it to, that maybe they shouldn't be allowed if they're not taking him. There's these underbellies, a lot of this discrimination. Anyway, has a history of non-compliance with treatment. Prior to the filing of a petition, at least twice within the last 36 months, has been a significant factor in necessitating hospitalization or receipt of services. So in the past 36 months, twice the person was in some form of institution or facility. And there was some act of serious violent behavior towards self or others. And this behavior towards self and others is very important, because what it used to be that danger to self was suicidal efforts and actions. And now in this environment, it's being blown up. And that's, if I had to say one thing today, that's the biggest threat, is this redefinition of danger to self that now allows so many more people to be put into involuntary treatment, inpatient and outpatient, both now. This is an incredible time, I must tell you. Anyway, prior to the filing petition, it resulted in one or more acts of serious violent behavior or attempts or harm towards self within the last 48 months. So now you have somebody who has maybe been in a hospital or facility a couple of times and is deemed to have made a comment, a thought, an action around that's viewed as dangerous. And that they're unlikely to voluntarily participate. Now that's a real assessment. I'm giving you an advocacy talk, am I not? I don't know if that's what you had in mind, but I'm just hot on the trail and the campaign is peaking. So forgive me, I'll be talking to you as if I'm talking about the campaign here. But so unlikely to voluntarily participate. And that has a lot to do with another big issue in this is engagement. There are people that would be far more than willing to engage in some form of help, assistance, treatment, whatever name you want to use, if that was presented in the correct way, if that was the treatment they really wanted, and it was the kind of thing you wanted to come back for. But here, what it says is you're unlikely to voluntarily participate without attribution to why that would be. That you're in need of an assisted treatment order because you'll probably get a relapse. Very subjective terms, right? A court may not issue an order until it finds that it's the least restricted alternative. This is a big one. Yesterday we were at the MISC meeting. That's all about people should live in the most integrated setting, the least restrictive by law, by ADA. But here it says people, they have to prove, and they never do, honestly, OMH does not monitor for this, that this was indeed the least restrictive, meaning if we didn't do this, they would be in a hospital or an institution. And to me, so often you'll find that AOT is first. It's not the last resort, and it's not the least restrictive. Who's eligible? An 18-year-old adult or older, a parent, who is eligible to, let me just look at this for a second. There are too many of these doohickeys on the screen. Okay. Oh, you know what? I can maybe make that go away. There we go. Sorry. Who can petition for an order? Someone 18 years old or older, a parent. These are people that can bring a complaint, a concern that can lead to somebody getting an order. So it could be a parent, spouse, child. It could be the director of a hospital, became directors of jails and prisons, directors of nonprofits, charity organizations, providers, what you see here essentially. A qualified psychiatrist who is treating the person, or psychologist, a social worker, the county mental health directors, and counties play a big role in this. There's $32 million of Kendras Law money out on the street, and it pays basically the counties to hire AOT coordinators who, follow through with petitions or orders, or try to help people get off them in some cases, or provide alternatives. But very often, being, the coordination of somebody being on an order. So the counties play a huge role here. The court order, the initial order, can extend for up to 1 year. A number of them are at 6 months, and then a decision is made then. And the order, again, must require the county director to provide services described in the order. The initial order can be extended for additional successive periods of time. So what happens is someone is concerned about your behavior. Someone objects to it. Someone's frightened by it. Somebody's, completely concerned about your well-being. I mean, it could cut any number of directions. You then file a petition with the county. The county, and now these AOT staff they'll do a evaluation. They may evaluate and recommend that this person be on a AOT order. County goes along with that. It's presented to a judge. Person goes to a hearing. I would say 96% of the time the orders are granted. So there's not, some people go with a lawyer, rights attorney, but most of them are pretty quickly granted. So now you have this order for at least 6 months or beyond. And the order is very often around medication and participation in clinic or other forms of treatment. There is something I want you to know about that was in the law as well, that, and maybe it's not well known, is that people are supposed to be offered a voluntary alternative, which in the statute is called Enhanced Voluntary Services, or EVS. What also isn't well known is there's a lot of them. In fact, there are as many EVSs as there are Kendras Law court orders, 20,000 each since 1999. And if you read the bottom, I mean, Kendras Law is minimally used upstate, God bless you, upstate, heavily used in New York City, Long Island, and some urban centers. But New York City makes up the predominance of the number of orders, like way the predominant. And the upstate psychiatrist said, we don't do it like the downstate people do. We use a voluntary order or voluntary arrangement. We don't approach it in an adversarial way. So EVS may not be entirely voluntary, but it certainly doesn't involve a judge. It involves you making an agreement. Maybe you think you have to. Maybe you actually get to drive that agreement, but there's a lot of them. And they should be used to compare the one to the other. I don't know if I mentioned the Bellevue study, but in 1999, there was this Bellevue study that the legislature sort of arranged for. And people at Bellevue, they identified groups of people with major needs who were coming back to the hospital regularly, and everybody got more and better services. And one half of the group got a court order, and the researchers found there was no difference. So that was a head-to-head scientific comparison. Got to 2005, the law has to be, this was our doing. We got the legislature to be willing to review it every 5 years, not make it permanent, stay in the game, keep an eye on it. It's controversial. We need your help with that. So that's what they do. They've extended the law even this year. They don't make it permanent. They sort of gave up on that. We would just block that. But so this sunsets every 5 years and starts in 2000. So in 2005, the state does an evaluation, and they don't find that. They find all these great things that have happened to people, but we don't really know why, because they didn't compare. Was it more or better services, or more and better services in the orders, or, are the orders really playing the key role, or are you, when you're being offered better services? Another thing about an order is it's a front of the line card. These are scant resources we have out here in terms of housing, case management. And if you get an order, you're at the front of the line. Anybody was waiting, they wait longer because you've got the order. And some orders are developed, not because they think people are violent, because they want to get them to the front of the line. People will say that. Anyway, so they do this the evaluation. The commissioner at the time says to me, oh, it's just program evaluation data. It's not head-to-head study. So we go to the assembly and we say, we need a study like Bellevue. So they mandated that there should be one. In 2005, they begin it. But in 2009, the researcher says, I was in the room when he did it, they couldn't compare the EVS and the Kendras Law. So we have this study that is quoted nationally about why people do better on so many levels. There's no doubt people are doing better. But the question is why? And was an order really needed, or is it just that people are getting quality front of the line sort of support? So that research has been challenged, certainly by us, for the longest time, although it's an uphill battle because it's quoted everywhere. The New York research. And other studies have rejected the study, saying they didn't have a randomized comparison group. And I've had this argument with one of the researchers, and last week he acknowledged in the newspaper, there's room for more research comparing assisted outpatient treatment with voluntary. So that argument is far from over. A lot of this has to do with violence. A big part of it, this is often seen as a public safety issue. Totally seen as a public use, which means it's predicated on the belief that we're violent, we're threatening. Now, as you may know, you may have heard this, people with mental illness are 11 times more likely to be victims. And I recently found this 5 times more likely to be victims of murder. So 11 times of violence in general, 5 times of murder. And Jeff Swanson, who was one of the researchers for the Kendras Law study, said, essentially, he said, look, if you really boil this down, 4% of all acts of violence, only 4 can be associated with the person with some form of diagnosis. And then here's the 2 researchers from the same study. Here's Swanson again saying, this is such a great quote. People who are interested in promoting outpatient commitment, rolling back civil commitment reforms, have focused on the violent issue because that is what moves public opinion. And they are playing into the beliefs of people who don't care much about mental illness, but who are concerned about public safety. People who understand what outpatient commitment is would never say it's a violence prevention strategy. But this study, the researcher says this, but the study is used to justify forced treatment got those results that he was studying. His co-researcher, Marvin Schwartz, I mentioned on the last page, he says there's no evidence that outpatient commitment orders can reduce major acts of violence. But you wouldn't know that because the New York Post, I think they have someone on staff full time to just be ready when there's some act of violence, and they can at all tie it to a person with mental illness. The Kendras Law, the failure to fully implement Kendras Law. This is a mantra that if we had had those orders, this violence wouldn't have happened. And it's just such nonsense, but it plays to the public, and the public is frightened, probably more than ever. COVID, Ukraine, there are subway pushings, there are homeless people, but they're afraid, and we're such a small number that really get involved in these crimes. I wish I had stats on all the subway pushings. This may sound a little lurid, and actually knew how many people had a diagnosis and how many people didn't, and how that played out. So these statistics I mentioned earlier about these 20,000 orders of the 2 also comes with research that is shown on the New York State OMH website. You could go there, go to the homepage, bottom left, it says reports, statistics and reports, work your way to AOT page, and you'll see that even as a couple of days ago, 77% of all the orders in New York City are Black and brown people. And statewide, it's 2 out of 3. So it's an extraordinary high profile. And any number of reasons to explain that. Certainly one has to be the failure by this system to properly engage people of color and offer them services. But there's an element of racism here. There's no accident that there's a hue and cry here when the few people that are involved in crime have been lately Black men who are homeless or in and out of hospital. So this attenuation, this connection between homeless, violent, mentally ill, African American, it lingers underneath this whole discussion. So they have tried for 22 years to expand Kendras Law and make it permanent. We've always stopped it from being made permanent, but the expansions are way ahead of us now. We've been fought of every expansion. But this year we are surrounded. And I thought this might happen. We had a new mayor who was very former cop, very responding to this whole public safety issue, totally understandable, but very engaged in Kendras Law. As a matter of fact, when he ran against Curtis Sliwa for the mayoralty, he was on the Republican side, Sliwa, he was saying, you know, there's too many people, this is a mantra too, who are on the street. We never should let them go. Deinstitutionalization failed. We should put people back in hospitals. And Sliwa was saying, you got a lot of room in Creedmoor. Take them off the street and put them there. That's what they need. That's what we need because they're violent. There's these groups that I mentioned earlier. This Treatment Advocacy Center is grant funded for all these years by the Stanley Foundation. That's all they do is go state to state. Brian Stetton is the lead on the policy side. And they are just waiting and wait. And they roll out their whole game plan when there's any act of violence. And they have access to the New York Post. And, you know, there's just other groups. This became sort of politicized. This other team got with the Republicans and they started making this a law and order and Republican issue for some people that see it that way. So then we had this terrible, so here we have new mayor, new governor. The other team is really like, they're all balled up and ready to go. This is terrible tragedy. Marshall Simon, African-American man, pushes Michelle Go, an Asian woman, into the subway. Now in New York, there's a huge increase in the number of acts of violence towards Asian Americans. So this has an extra level of fear and anger. And so he pushes Marshall Simon, Michelle Go, to her death, and that just triggers everything. We've had other subway pushings, you know, by people with diagnoses, very few, but this one was the one. And so there's became this huge public cry about the violent mentally ill, the homeless mentally ill. And then sadly, like I mentioned before, we've been spared we haven't gotten a break here. There's been more episodes of violence by people with mental illness and people of color in this case. So it really feeds that whole public fear and discrimination and determination. There's a senator down Staten Island who's really pushing this. In the past, we've had strong connections with the Assembly and the Senate, particularly the Assembly, and they have bottled up these proposals to expand Kendras Law. But we're really up against it. And so as of even the last week, there are people on the Senate, within the Democratic majority conference within the Senate, that are very ambivalent about bottling it up this time around. And the same on the Senate side. We have wonderful chairs. Senator Samara Brook from Rochester, mental health committee chair, is way out, the best ally I've ever had. We just wrote an op-ed together, and some of the calls coming in, we're trying to find a way to get it in the paper, in the right paper at the right time. The other thing is it's an election. So the governor in particular is running for office. She's done a lot of good things, but not here. And but she's concerned about New York City vote and the mayor and the concern out of New York City. So that plays into what's happening here. I'll catch up with it in a minute. How am I doing on time? Anybody can tell me? Yeah, I can't see.
It's 11:42, so I think you're good.
I'm good. How much time do I have though?
We booked it for an hour and a half, so you have until 12:30.
Okay, what time is it now?
11:45.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Lindsay. So, so the governor has come out, you know, over the last couple of years, they come out with these proposals to expand and make Kendras Law permanent. Each year we push it back. This year, the governor came out with 3 proposals. One was to allow a person whose 6-month order had expired to be placed back on an order without all that due process for vague reasons. If they have experienced a substantial increase in symptoms, they could be placed back on an order without full due process. The second one was they wanted providers to know that they were required to give out information to the counties on information on people who they were looking at for a Kendras Law order. And the third one was to let physicians or testify at the court hearing, but virtually. We didn't have a problem with that, but the first two clearly we had a problem with, around patient confidentiality, and most of all, putting people back in an order. So we work with the legislature, and I testify and other people testify, and the Senate rejects all three of these amendments last couple of weeks ago. And the Assembly rejects the first two and goes with the third on testifying, but makes it subject to patient consent. So that makes it even more tenuous. So we begin this fight, and there's still a big hue and cry about what are we going to do. The amendments are up. There's a lot of discussion. There's newspaper articles. We're in the papers. They're in the papers. These terrible crimes are happening in the backdrop. And we have these new sort of political environments. So this is the worst I've ever seen. And I'm not even telling you it all. So what our argument was, this is not about locking people up or forcing them to take medicine. I personally take medicine. I like my diagnosis and I like my psychiatrist. Not everybody does, but I think it should be a choice. I choose my psychiatrist, I choose my diagnosis, I choose my medication, among other things that I do in my recovery. So here are these alternatives. We're trying to say, look, you don't need to go deeper into force. If you're concerned about people's well-being, then let's look at all these new things that are coming online now and let those take effect before we just ratchet up more coercion. So we talk about housing first. Think about people who we're talking about, people who are the subject of these discussions: homeless people, people who've been in and out of hospital, people who maybe have been in and out of jail for any number of reasons. So we say, look, we got answers here. We have housing first, which takes people whether they're taking medicine or using drugs and alcohol or not. It's a marvelous model, and it actually back in the day was successful. And the same group that's subject to a Kendras Law order was able to engage them, and they stayed in housing for 80% of the time. They would stay in long-term housing. So they were engaged in some fashion because we gave them what they really wanted. And many people don't start with medication. They may want to get there, but they don't. Right now, they want to get off the street. This is about engagement. Start where people are, a tenet of peer support. So housing first totally makes sense in that regard. Now they have these safe haven programs, which are similar to housing first. It's low threshold. They're actually shelters that are primo, private rooms, quality support, just a much more humane environment and low threshold. You don't have to, you can go in again with symptoms and not be on medication, and they'll take you. Now we're developing a whole lot of crisis services, and I'll just jump around lists. We have 988 that's coming up in a couple of months. That's a big deal in terms of improving crisis. And a lot of this discussion is on Kendras Law is, how can we get ahead of crises so that people aren't in a position where they're subject to a possible order or an encounter with a police officer that was unnecessary and went bad, sometimes to a tragic killing. I'll talk about Daniel Prude a little bit. It's about getting ahead of crisis. So now we have this 988 thing coming online. So people won't reflexively call 911, which reflexively sends out a police officer, which often escalates a person, gets them admitted or worse. So 988. And then there are counselors. We want some of the counselors to be peers. I don't know how we have to really work at that. It's more informal. It's not a rule or reg. But we want people, to have the right kind of conversation. If it's determined by the person that they need more, now we'll have these crisis stabilization centers. There'll be 24-hour minus a minute programs, 12 in the state that'll be coming up. Not fast enough. And the other thing to know about them is, as good as they are, they're only one day. So, but we have other programs, particularly in Western New York and Buffalo. We have this under one roof programs. Stabilization, yes, but if you need more, in the same building is going to be an overnight, an overnight program, a 28-day program. So we have answers to when people are in crisis, and it's not being slapped on an order or being put in a hospital, alternatives to hospitals. So we have these respite programs, and we have a great program. We have one of the world's models, the Rose House model out of Poughkeepsie, Steve Michio and People USA. And there's 10 of them at least in New York State. So there's another homegrown, Housing First is homegrown in New York. So is the Rose House model in the way that they do it there. But that's another option. Then there's this, we have a living room model, which actually in Westchester County is very peer. These are all peer models, by the way, not the necessary housing for safe haven, but these crisis respite programs, the living room model, which is more another alternative to an emergency room. It's a more peer and warm and environment. The respite models are actually probably what I could have used when I was in the hospital. A place to go, softer lights, you get to sleep on your own time, you get to eat. He's even got guitars there. I would love that. So it's more humane. Right, when you're in an early crisis, I think the last thing you want to do is be in an emergency room with flashing lights and you're waiting forever and you feel highly stressed. That doesn't make any sense. So these are the alternative places that we have. Okay, let me see. Here we go. And then there's non-residential ones. We have the governor put forward money for 20 safe option support teams, which are multidisciplinary teams that would, be in the city and helping people. We created a model. We've gotten the assembly to be against Kendras Law, and they once said to me, well, what are you for? What is your answer there? So we created a model based on Pierre Bridger and went down to Westchester and worked with the MHA, and they have a model that engages people that otherwise would be on a court order. And 80% of the time they engage them voluntarily. That's a huge statistic. We use that program and that statistic regularly at the national and state level. We just met with INSET and NOMH, and these are $500,000 programs. I encourage the independent living centers to let's stay in touch about this. If we're successful, and 500 may be the right or wrong number depending on where you are, but it's a peer-led outreach and engagement model. As a matter of fact, that program is expanding into Rockland and Orange, and in Doug Hovey, your own Doug Hovey and our own Doug Hovey. And independent living is going to provide subcontract for some of the peer aspects of the program, but they do a great job. We have our own Pierre Bridger model that helps people leave and stay out of hospital. New York City's got intensive mobile teams. New York City has this model called Pathway Home. We don't have time to get into it now, but it's another transitional model. There's forensic peer support, there are clubhouses, there's a lot. So our point has been there's a lot of things. Let's get people what they really need. Let's not force them into the failed services. Let's fix the services. Fix, not force. Don't force people into failed services. Some time ago, people were saying, it's not about training police to do a better job when they go out and encounter our people. It's about sending someone else. So that's a big trend. It comes out of an Oregon model called CAHOOTS, crisis assistance helping out on the streets. And it's a mental health counselor with an EMT. Can be a peer, but it's a mental health counselor. And they have an extraordinary record over 30 years with very little few arrests few arrests and even fewer episodes of tragedy. Hardly any, I think, tragedy. So they're a model. We're really talking about it a lot in New York State. There's a model in New York City. Our peer and legal rights friends have put together a model. Correct crisis intervention, New York City today, New York City. But Daniel's Law, and I just want to spend a second on Senator Brooks. Senator Brooks is an extraordinary leader, and she's out far on Kendras Law. Like I say, they worked with me. They wanted me to write an op-ed with her. She's out far on this thing. God bless her. And Daniel Prude was killed by the police, African-American man, actually having an overdose from PCP. And 911 sent the police. If we had 988, maybe when the brother called, maybe something else would have happened. Police came and they killed him. I mean, they basically, the approaches they took wound up in his death. And that was the ruling, the finding that they contributed to that. So Daniel Prude, so it became a campaign, and Senator Brooke and Assemblyman Bronson from that area are crafting a bill called Daniels Law. And in short version, it would create in every county a mental health and medical alternative response to first response to people in mental health crisis. So that's a big deal. We're working with the groups on Daniels Law. We're trying to be helpful there as well. Not sure it'll get out this year. All right, so if that wasn't bad enough, involuntary inpatient commitment is, we have been able to stop an expansion of that. I mean, it's danger to self as men. You're really dangerous to yourself. Clear suicidal plan or a serious risk in a variety of ways. Well, this is a big trend now that's being redefined to be imminently dangerous. You can be now involuntarily admitted in a psychiatric unit if your danger to self comes in the form of you're having trouble, you have a mental illness, you may even have some symptoms, but the key here is you're having trouble with food, clothing, shelter, and medication. So for those broad, indistinct reasons, you can now be involuntarily admitted to a psych ward. And that we fought it off successfully last year, but OMH decided, and apparently it's true, that they didn't need to get a law passed. They already had that power. So you're going to be seeing that if you're not now, will it be a quicker move to admit people because the danger to self criteria has expanded in a very subjective way. And now, so I'm not in the greatest mood. So if I seem like bummed out, I am. Last Friday, it got worse. Again, with all this hubbub and the elections and violence in New York City, we had another couple of subway and other related incidents. Again, rare, but bad. And the newspapers are ready to play these up, particularly the Post. So what they're saying now is, let me just catch up with what this is. Yeah, the bottom line is, that's it. The bottom line is when I mentioned to you that they expand inpatient commitment criteria and expand the definition of dangerous self to be food, shelter, clothing, whatever. Now they would do this with AOT, with Kendras Law. So those earlier criteria I read you about, several hospitalizations or maybe a potential threat, things like that. It's as low now as food, shelter, clothing, presence of a mental illness. So that's a big thing going on now, redefining danger to self as a grounds for of coercive sort of treatment. Well, that's the end of that. I'm sorry if I'm ending on a bummer here. But I think the hope I have is that I think each time you have these, you just educate more people about that violence is not the issue, that engagement is the issue, proper engagement, that new services and options, which we now have more and more of them, are really the true answer, the true remedies, and not a view of people as violent who need to be in forced into treatment. Look, we all worry. There are some people we see that we're terribly worried about ourselves, and we would say, well, maybe there needs to be an order. All I would say is that everything needs to be tried, and that's not the way this is going to work at all. Before these policies are being considered, it used to be, it's supposed to be a last resort. It is now to the front of the line, this idea of coercion. So you've been great, you independent living centers, our friends, for so long that Just so you know, one of the ways that I mentioned at the beginning that we entered into the disability world and made mental health join the club with you and work with you. One of the first things we did, we worked with NYSILC and Housing Works AIDS HIV group, and a bunch of us got arrested and got the Medicaid buy-in approved. So that was a joint effort: independent living, AIDS, HIV, and NYAPRS mental health. So, there's room for, in some ways, people now understand slowly, I think, not violent, alternatives to coercion. But in this environment, it gets lost very easy. As of today, I'll just tell you, I'm working with the center and some of these emails coming in with a media outlet to give us another sort of crack at this. 2 weeks ago, another thing of hope. We came to town, NYAPRS did. We made this our point. We got 3 TV interviews, a radio interview, 8 print sort of articles. I was asked to do something on Showtime. So there is a receptivity. We saw that with this issue. The politics rolls it, and we're back to Democrats, Republicans, elections, and an episode in the paper, this other team, being so good at being so bad in that regard. So we have our work sort of cut out for us, but I have hope that hopefully maybe we'll be able to stop these last amendments. As of today, the newspaper said this may be one of the few things that gets by, which means gets approved. So that's why I'm not in a great mood this morning, but we'll need you out there. We've sent out a call to action. Lindsay has signed on behalf of your organization, but we need each of and Doug has, and Aileen Martin has, but we need all the ILCs to sign that letter that says we reject these amendments by the governor and reject the use of coercion in this environment. So let me stop and see, I did wound up a lot on the politics, a little less so on the program itself, but I'll take any questions, however you guys want to do it. Turn on the camera, open the mics.
So people can use the Q&A function, or if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you while people get their hands raised or write up other questions. I did drop into the chat the letter that Harvey referenced, as well as the instructions for signing on. I also, while we were on this webinar, sent it out to all the ILC executive directors and the advocate listserv. So if those of you on can, help keep the center signed on, I think the more organizations, the better at this point. Doesn't look like we have any questions yet. We'll give it another minute.
No, Lindsay, this goes till 12:45. We're not leaving.
Well, I think this was great. And I said to Harvey before we got on that, I knew it was terrible timing for him, but I think it was timely for us because it is a budget priority for us. We want to be supportive to NYAPRS advocacy efforts. And, there's very little time left in the budget session. So looks like
they're going to wrap up the budget. They have to by next Friday.
Yeah.
So this is game time.
Yeah. So Alex, in the chat, here, Martha has a question. Harvey, do you know of any programs in Florida for these individuals?
So do you mean voluntary alternatives? You mean like these drop-in centers and outreach teams and respite programs? Is that what you mean? Yes. Yeah. I mean, I can't spill them off right now, but Florida has been progressive. That's where self-directed care was sort of born, where people get their, be able to access money to buy things they need that fit their goals. So there are some progressive areas in Florida. I wouldn't say there's a ton of them, but probably should go online actually. Or if you send me an email, I can forward it to maybe some people in Florida. So thank you, Geraldine. There was another, I thought, question up here. Oh, that's Martha. Okay. My email address is, I'm glad you asked me. I also want to give you our website, because if you go on, sort of on the bottom right, you'll see in the right column the news I put out every day. And at the bottom of that is a way you can subscribe to that listserv, because everything I've talked about, anything that's new about it, that's going on, I usually put out. So you'll be able to get it through our listserv.
Someone just noted that today is the anniversary of Daniel Prude's death.
Last night, there was a memoriam. I think I put this on the e-news, and some of you might have been able to show up and see it. It was very, very touching. And, I go back to the 60s and where they talk about teach-ins, where, people educate each other. And that was just so moving. The advocates there talking about discrimination, racism, choice, and in such a moving way. Yes, let's click on that. So what you'll see here, if you click on that, is just the cover letter. We have the actual letter that you could see, but if you want to cheat, you have my email address. And if you simply say, my agency is willing to be a signatory, here's my name. Hopefully you have authority to do that, CEO or CEO's approval or whatever. My name, my title, and my agency. We'll just add your name. We'll cut to the chase. Just email me, read this thing here, and if it's enough for you, give us your name and information. And if you need more, we'll send you the guts of the petition that we want you to sign with us. We need as many. We're sending a list right now. We don't have as many as we'd like. I think we have 60 agencies. You could add us 30. If Lindsay and all of you would sign up, it would be great, because we're sending this evening to every legislator, and so on time that we do that. Okay.
All right.
Lindsay,
That's it.
I can
Thank you,
go
Harvey,
back
for
to
your
work.
time.
I
Yeah.
can go back to my advocacy now.
Yes, please do. Keep us posted. Let us know what else we can do. And thank you for taking the time to provide this presentation today.
You bet. Thanks, everybody. Join the fight.
Thank you to our 2022 webinar series sponsor, Waymo. Waymo is an autonomous driving technology company with a mission to make it safe and easy for people and things to get where they're going. We believe that fully autonomous technology holds the promise to improve road safety and offer new mobility options to millions of people. This is why we're designing Waymo Driver, our autonomous technology to give people a new kind of freedom to go where they want, when they want, while making the frustrations and concerns with driving a thing of the past. Logo fades into view. New York Association on Independent Living.